Good afternoon, everybody. As is the, well, for the record, my name is Bob Haynes. I am privileged to be the president of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO, representing hundreds of thousands of working families here in this Commonwealth. And as is the usual custom of the labor movement, before we begin any event or any meeting, we pledge allegiance to our flag. If I could ask you all to stand up. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. And thanks for joining us on this momentous occasion. We have come together to honor one of our own in the labor movement. This is an extraordinary day for the labor movement here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We come here to honor a man that actually gave his life in the service of working men and women here in this Commonwealth. If you think of the circumstances of Edward Cohen's life and what he did to advance the agenda of working families, it's actually astonishing. And to think by an accident of history, the accident of history, the most significant accident of history of he being in the governor's office, at the very moment that a disgruntled, disillusioned citizen came into the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with a firearm to do harm to the governor, met the president of the AFL, secretary-treasurer of the AFL, and the legislative agent of the AFL, and proceeded to open fire, mortally wounding my predecessor, the president of the AFL, 2 years ago, injuring the secretary-treasurer. And interesting historical fact, the legislative agent and the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts actually wrestled this man to the ground and took the weapon away from him. But you think we do Workers' Memorial Day every year to memorialize workers who go to work in the morning and have the misfortune of working in an unsafe work site and lose their life and don't return home to the family. It's exactly what happened to Edward Cohen. He went to work representing all of us and our predecessors and tried to advance a moral and social and economic agenda for working people in this Commonwealth, and he was killed at the age of 49, right upstairs in the governor's office. I can't tell you how many times I've had the opportunity to sit in that anteroom, and it amazes me that that kind of violence could be visited in a public institution. And so when you see that state police officer sitting outside that office, you know now why he is there. It's a direct result of the assassination of our president. And Jimmy Green's here today, and the other piece of labor history that it's always great to celebrate labor history, but this is another accident of history. I have been, as the Secretary-Treasurer, now as the President of the AFL-CIO, the keeper of the records of the state AFL-CIO, and in my thirst for information and knowledge, had the opportunity to read all the early history of this state labor movement and all the records of all our conventions. And just by happenstance came across the 1908 record of the convention of the state Fed, where it recognized what happened to Edward Cohen. I, like all of you, I presume, have never heard this story. I was shocked. And then we spent some time researching the record and got the newspapers. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see the newspapers and see the outpouring of support and affection for this labor leader 100 years ago, and the lying in the State House, and the procession from the State House down to South Station, where his body was taken to Brooklyn, New York, to be buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn. It was quite an extraordinary story to hear all of that. And so I would ask you, before we even begin to reflect on his career and move the agenda along a little bit, that it's also appropriate, as we pledge allegiance to our flag, but we also stand for a moment of silent reflection, and in your own way, maybe say a prayer for Edward Cohen, maybe say a prayer for this labor movement, maybe say a prayer for peace or the future of our great society. So if I can ask you to join me in a moment of prayer. Thank you. Thank you very much. So a little about Edward Cohen's history. He was born in London in 1858, came to Massachusetts, settled in Boston, lived in Lynn. He was a cigar factory worker, a cigar maker, and reports have it friendly with Sam Gompers, who was also a cigar maker, the first president of the AFL. He worked in the West End, and that's where he first became exposed to labor activism and organized labor through his union, and as an activist rose up through the ranks. He became the president of the AFL, predecessor of the AFL-CIO in 1906, and he was a tireless advocate for workers. If you know anything about the history of the early part of this century, Jim Green, if you don't, Jim Green will make sure you do. There are a lot of issues around child labor laws, and kids as young as age 7 and 8 and 9 worked in textile manufacturing plants. And he was, as a parent of 8, was obviously opposed to having children working in manufacturing facilities. And he fought for the quality of life for working people in this Commonwealth. He fought for kids. He passed legislation that actually changed child labor laws here in this Commonwealth. He made sure that kids under the age of 16 could not go to work. Under 16 could not go to work, Richard, unless they could read and write. You had to have some level of education before you were allowed to go and work in these facilities, manufacturing facilities. He also passed a bill that prevented children under the age of 14 from working during school hours. So even if you could read and write and you were under 14 years old, think about this for a second. Imagine our kids trumping off to work at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I mean, it's just inconceivable to us in this day and age. He was also a huge advocate of worker safety. And workers' compensation was a big deal around the turn of the century in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and he played a great role